Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Millette with an AP European History presentation. Today's presentation is about the interwar period. That is the 20-year period from 1919 to 1939 between World War I and World War II. In terms of the interwar period, students will be expected to be able to demonstrate their understanding of these three learning objectives. 1. Explain the causes and effects of the global economic crisis in the 1920s and 1930s. 2. Explain the factors that led to the development of fascist and totalitarian regimes in the aftermath of World War I. And 3. Explain how and why various political and ideological factors resulted in the catastrophe of World War I. The interwar period between 1919 and 1939 is often referred to as a 20 years crisis. Throughout Europe, new democratic nations were unstable, and tensions between and among political groups flared. Additionally, the onset of a worldwide economic crisis, dubbed the Great Depression, would challenge the practice of capitalism in the industrial nations. Its reach would severely impact many underdeveloped regions as well. In essence, this 20 years crisis captured the imperfections and failures of both democracy and capitalism in one of the most vulnerable periods of time in modern European history. This PowerPoint will focus on the debatable causes of the Great Depression, the responses to the Great Depression, especially the political responses by states and their governments in Europe, and also the interwar period and the political as well as economic ideologies that are ultimately going to lead Europe back into war, ultimately World War II. The next several slides will address the various debatable causes of the Great Depression that will be experienced during the interwar period. More specifically, the next 4 slides will focus on the unraveling of capitalism, that is to say, the imperfections of Europe's capitalistic economy as it had been practiced to the point of the Great Depression. Europeans of industrialized nations experienced a new level of consumerism and the use of consumer credit during the development of mass society during the Second Industrial Revolution. Prior to World War I, Europeans experienced La Belle Epoque and hoped for a return to normalcy after the Great War. However, with a recent history of highly volatile markets and the increased material well-being of Europeans, people became accustomed to the good life. This increased consumerism continued its exposure of the imperfections of capitalism. One thing that stands out about industrialization and the practice of free market economics is the conflation of the amount of material possessions one has with the quality of life one has. The motivation to do work for a wage so as to be able to ascertain material goods was a major characteristic of industrialized life. In earlier times in history, religious and ideological foundations actually warned followers of the dangers of accumulating wealth and material possessions. For example, Christianity encouraged its followers to give charity so as to help the less fortunate. However, capitalism, a product of secularized Enlightenment idealism, did not seek to employ traditional teachings of moderation, acts of charity, and asceticism, but rather it sought to employ a work ethic, entrepreneurship, and financial profit. In essence, work, wage, and materialism was equated with human contentment. Europeans existed in a world with infinite wants but finite resources. So whoever could obtain the greater portion of those finite resources was deemed ahead of others who were less fortunate. The proverbial rat race that is shown in the comic strip captures that cycle of work, wage, things, happiness. In spite of cultural, ideological, and religious influence that attempted to steer people away from their own materialistic wants, capitalism tended to win out by the outbreak of the Great Depression. The image below the comic strip shows a natural landscape adorned with billboards showcasing corporate advertisements. In the Second Industrial Revolution, mass production and mass consumption was complemented by mass marketing and mass distribution. Corporations took to mass marketing like billboards so as to push people to purchase material goods. But what if the time comes when employment reduces, wages decrease, and demand declines to where people cannot afford material goods? Unfortunately, for a generation of people who had experienced enhanced consumer materialism, the desire for material goods would not diminish just because the ability to purchase consumer goods did diminish. This slide, which continues with the unraveling and imperfections of capitalism as one of the causes to the global Great Depression, focuses on capitalism's relative instability and unpredictability. Economic instability has been the historical experience throughout the modern age. This is especially so in the capitalistic economies of the industrialized nations, including the United States and the nations in Europe. Recessions, panics, temporary crises, and sometimes booms and bull markets and other times have made economic activity difficult to predict, prevent, and correct. Generally, capitalism could fix itself, as the natural forces of supply and demand would bring economic activity back to equilibrium. But what if it doesn't correct itself fast enough? Take a look at the business cycle of the United States for the 70-year period of 1835 to 1905, shown in the timeline graph below. Notice the peaks and troughs of the American business cycle. Equilibrium was not an economic mainstay throughout America's first century of industrialization and capitalism. About the only thing that one could really predict about capitalism is that it is unpredictable. Peaks don't last, troughs will surely follow, but the trough won't last, and a peak will come back. But what if the trough lasts too long? What if the peak doesn't come fast enough? What if the natural forces of supply and demand do not correct the business cycle? This slide continues with the back end of America's historical business cycle, as the timeline graph below focuses on the 20th century. Take a look at the continued instability of the American business cycle from 1910 to 1985, indicated in the timeline graph below. What conclusions can you draw about the United States' historic business cycle? What tends to correlate with economic booms and peaks? What tends to correlate with economic decline and troughs? And can you explain these correlations? One thing I notice is that when America is at war, the business cycle is reaching peaks. However, when America is in peacetime, the business cycle slips into a trough. Interestingly, the years of the Cold War, to be studied in this class later this semester, From 1945 to 1991, there are fewer troughs in the business cycle and noticeably more peaks. Consider why war, or the potential for war, as in the case of the Cold War, may create an economic situation where the business cycle is experiencing more peaks. This slide, which also continues with the unraveling and imperfections of capitalism as one of the causes to the Great Depression, focuses on capitalism's propensity to create socioeconomic inequality within industrialized societies. Socioeconomic inequality is a cornerstone of capitalism. Recall, capitalism does not promise equality of the distribution of wealth, land, goods, and wages. That's what communism and socialism promise. In fact, capitalism embraces the opposite. It promises that wealth, land, goods, and wages will not be distributed evenly. It's a classic case of winners and losers. Recall, European governments weren't supposed to be in the business of business. And aside from antitrust laws and a few political parties that had gained some momentum in affecting changes in unions, wages, hours, and conditions, socioeconomic inequality was not a problem that governments were expected to correct. However, when recession turned to depression, the imperfections of capitalism were magnified, including socioeconomic inequality. Check out the images below to get a visual understanding of socioeconomic inequality as it was magnified in times of economic despair. The bottom left photo shows some working class beggars out front of a restaurant in London during the Great Depression. The second photo from the left shows some underemployed German workers demonstrating against the Weimar Republic. In the photo third from the left, Hooverville is depicted. Hooverville became the name of the homeless community that formed in Central Park in Manhattan after the Great Depression began. In the foreground, you can see the shanties that were built in Central Park, and the park is filled with New Yorkers, mostly males, adorned in business suits, worker uniforms, and professional attire. In spite of their appearances, the harsh reality was they were facing unemployment, homelessness, and financial insecurity. In the background is the bourgeois urban setting of Midtown Manhattan, where many brokers, investors, and professionals lived. The condos and high-rise apartments of Midtown Manhattan in the background, juxtaposed with the homeless community of Central Park in the foreground, exposes the magnified imperfection of capitalism's severe socioeconomic inequality. In the photo in the bottom right of the slide, there is a background image of a traditional American family of 4+ little Scruffy there hanging out the rear passenger window. The family is smiling, clothed well, and riding in a car, which implies they are living a fairly materialistic lifestyle and have benefited from the forces of capitalism. They're living the world's highest standard of living, the American way. In the foreground of the image is a line of unemployed, and underemployed American citizens waiting in a financial aid relief line to receive emergency funds so as to be able to purchase the basic necessities of life, such as food, medicine, and clothing. The photographer imaged this contrasting foreground and background, which exposed the greater magnification of the imperfections of capitalism. In this case, the socio-economic inequality that was magnified when an economic crisis with high levels of unemployment set in on an industrialized society. This slide addresses the difficulty that societies faced with transitioning from a wartime economy like that of the time of World War I to a peacetime economy like that of the 1920s and 1930s of the interwar period. Consider, is it really likely that unemployment will be an issue when there's a war? Is it really possible to overproduce things like armaments, food, medicine, and clothing when total war is occurring in so much of the world? Well, during the Great War, it was nearly impossible to overproduce, especially in war material. Imagine a farmer or a business owner who produced at wartime levels and is now forced to produce at peacetime levels. They'd almost rather the war keep going. If they reduce production, factories close, fields lay barren, and unemployment rises. If they keep production levels in peacetime, then supply is too high, prices plummet, and then factories close, fields lay barren, and unemployment rises. The difficulty for producers within industrialized societies was finding the balance between supply and demand. A business owner or a farmer that could not find that balance was doomed to financial failure. Take a look at the political cartoon to the right titled The Stumbling Block from 1930, the first year of the Great Depression. In the cartoon, the subject is a farmer who represents the farm industry, who is tripping over a bale of wheat that represents the overproduction of agricultural goods. The farmer has tripped and has lost the grip of a basket of eggs, which represents the price of American crops like cotton and wheat falling. In essence, when farmers overproduced crops like wheat and cotton, there would be an abundance of supply that was not met with an equal demand. This forced wheat and cotton prices to decline. Those declined prices killed farmers' profits, abilities to pay wages, and ability to maintain farm equipment. Overproduction happened when farmers failed to transition from wartime production levels to peacetime production levels, and in effect, their profits suffered severely. This was an extremely difficult transition to make for American and English farmers, whose production remained high during the war because their countries were not settings of World War I battlefronts, like in the case of France, Germany, and Russia. The European nation that was hardest hit by the Great Depression was undoubtedly Germany. These next two slides focus on Germany's financial struggles, and those struggles negatively impacted other European nations. After the Great War, Europe was economically and physically devastated. Economically, England and France owed billions in war debts to their ally, the United States. Worse, the new Weimar Republic in Germany owed even more billions of dollars in punitive reparations to England and France. France and England needed German repayment. The United States needed French and English repayment. All of this hinged upon Germany's ability or inability to pay their punitive reparations. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to disarm, minimize industrial production, and relinquish overseas colonies. How was this young republic supposed to pay their $32 billion in reparations? Solution number one: print more money. Of course, it led to hyperinflation and the failure of the German market, and it didn't get England and France paid. This led to France invading the Ruhr, an industrial region of Germany, as a consequence of Germany's defaults between 1923 and 1925. When I was in kindergarten, I remember being in a department store with my mother. Of course, I dragged her down the toy aisle in that store and tried to cajole her to buy me a toy, probably a Transformer, a He-Man figure, a G.I. Joe hero or vehicle, maybe a Lego set, or even a pack of Garbage Pail Kids stickers. Naturally, my mother told me that we did not have enough money to buy a toy that day, and that I would have to be patient and wait until we did have enough money to buy it. In my 5-year-old kindergarten mind, I rationalized an immediate solution to our financial problem. Mom, if we don't have enough money right now, why can't we just create more money so that we can buy it? My mother's response was, "Son, that isn't how things work. Trust me, we will return when we have the money." I left it at that, but in my head, I knew my kindergarten solution would work. Take a look at the top right image. This is a photograph of a young German woman feeding German marks, the currency of the Weimar Republic, into a furnace in her home. Why not just use that fat stack of cash to pay her energy bill? Who on earth would ever literally use cash as kindling in their furnace? Well, the harsh reality of Germany's hyperinflation was that a stack of cash that large was so devalued that it could not pay the hyperinflated energy bill that she was assessed with in her home. Take a look at the bottom right image. This is a photograph of two German children using German marks in their arts and crafts. You got it. Construction paper was more expensive than the stack of cash the kids have on that table. In essence, German marks were so devalued that blank construction paper was valued higher than printed German paper money. German hyperinflation is inconceivable to people today. In 1923, the exchange rate of the German mark to the US dollar was about 4 trillion marks to $1 US. You heard right, 4 trillion with a T. In simple terms, if a loaf of bread in Brooklyn, New York, cost $1 US, then that same loaf of bread sold in a market in Berlin, Germany, would cost approximately 4 trillion German marks. How does one account for that sort of transaction? How high or low of bills does one use to satisfy that transaction? How long does one wait for their change to be given back to them by a cashier when we're dealing with a simple transaction such as the purchase of bread that involved trillions of marks? How did this hyperinflation set in for Germany in the early to mid 1920s? The kindergarten solution. When the Weimar Republic of Germany did not have the cash to pay their monthly installments of wartime reparations to the English and French governments, the German government took to printing more German marks. This completely devalued the German mark and put Germany's economy into ruin. Perhaps my mother's advice would have helped Germany at this point, had they been patient and found another method to pay for something they could not afford at present time. Germany's failed attempt to solve its monetary problem would eventually spill into the other European economies. France and England needed Germany to be able to pay their war reparations, but Germany's initial solution to merely print more money was a dismal failure. Solution number 2, borrow money. As opposed to the kindergarten solution, we could maybe call this one the young adult solution, to borrow money. If governments were willing to support lending firms to make international loans to governments that weren't quite of adolescent age, and pre-adolescent governments were willing to take those loans with interest rates, then what's the harm? All those good intentions, what could possibly go wrong? Well, the United States, a global financial powerhouse, enacted the Dawes Plan, which is indicated to the right on this slide, to loan money to Germany so that Germany could pay its reparations to France and England, so that France and England could repay the United States the wartime debt they accrued from wartime loans by American lenders. Remember, the United States didn't want to get entangled into European political conflicts, but it had no problem getting into their economic problems. Unfortunately for England and France, in spite of America's Dawes Plan, Germany could not keep up with its reparations payments. To make matters even more grim, over the next 10 years, the German government would transition into a government that would purposely not play by the preset guidelines of international economic cooperation. This slide pinpoints the exact point where the global financial ruin took place, the stock market crash in 1929. The New York Stock Exchange was the largest and most diverse stock exchange in the world. American and foreign companies were listed, as well as American and foreign investors spent their money on stocks. Up to October of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange had experienced a bull market. In hindsight, the bull market may have been a result of stock speculation, the purchase of stocks on the margin, and overconfidence in the strength of the stock market. Eventually, prices of stocks reached their pinnacle and had only one direction to go: down. It left investors who were looking to sell stocks to make a quick profit with nobody to buy. It left brokers with indebted clients. It left companies with no investors, and ultimately it collapsed the financial market of the United States and all those that were tied to it internationally. In the image on the top right, you can see a crowd of Wall Street brokers surrounding the deceased body of one of their own. Evidently, there were two stock market crash suicides on Wall Street in the days following Black Thursday in 1929. In the image to the bottom right is a photo of the mass panic bank withdrawals that Americans made in the face of the ensuing financial crisis. This panic happened between 1930 and 1931 and was still problematic by early 1933. Too many banks were not members of the Federal Reserve, and therefore, when Americans panicked and withdrew their money en masse, the non-member banks emptied their vaults of reserve cash in order to meet panicking Americans' demands. It was a clear sign that America's financial system was in complete disarray. This slide focuses on how some nations' governments' immediate reactions actually worsened the Great Depression and caused it to become a more globalized experience. Prior to the Great Depression, economic panics and crises were typically a single nation's problem. That problem did not typically extend to more nations across the globe. However, as nations' governments, lending firms, and corporations became more interdependent in a globalizing economy, the Great Depression became a global problem. In the past, nations' governments would practice autarky or protectionism. In essence, they would raise tariffs in order to protect domestic businesses and workers by driving the price of imports up so that citizens would buy domestic products. However, when governments applied this traditional method to solving a national economic crisis to a global economic crisis, the amount of global trade plummeted. As a result, nations whose economies were dependent on imports and exports were crippled. One such attempt was the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, begrudgingly enacted by President Herbert Hoover. In the newspaper clipping in the top right of the slide, you can see that economists, especially classical economists, asked Hoover to veto the bill, as they believed the tariff would have negative effects on global trade. In consequence, the image in the bottom right of the slide shows the downward trend of global trade measured in billions of US dollars. This is the final slide that addresses the various potential causes for the global Great Depression. To this point, we've focused on how industrialized nations and their economies were negatively impacted. Few national economies remained out of the reach of the globalizing Great Depression. And in fact, even agricultural and industrially underdeveloped economies were also hard hit by the globalizing Great Depression. This slide focuses on how one of these regions of the underdeveloped world, Latin America, was severely impacted by the global Great Depression. Non-industrialized economies of Latin America and the European colonies of Africa and Asia were not left out of the Great Depression. In fact, these economies were dependent on the industrialized nations' purchases of primary exports. Primary products such as beef, coffee, cocoa, and resources such as copper and rubber were exported from Latin America and European colonies of Africa and South and Southeast Asia. As industrialized nations of North America and Europe no longer demanded these primary products because they could no longer afford them, the national economies of these underdeveloped nations failed. Take a look at the resource map on the right side of the slide. The map indicates the different crops and resources in which Latin American economies were dependent. Many of these crops and resources are primary products, meaning they are in a raw and unprocessed state when they are harvested or extracted. Take, for example, cotton or sugar. Both of these are primary products prior to them being refined or processed into a finished good or product. Consider anything that is grown out of the ground, mined out of the ground, or grazed on the ground as a pool of primary products. Probably the best example of a Latin American nation whose economy suffered severely from the steep decline of trade and sales of primary products with industrialized nations was Argentina. Argentina was one of the world's leading suppliers of beef. In fact, its number one buyer of Argentine beef was England, one of the most industrialized nations in the world. When the Great Depression struck England, and their ability to purchase or trade for resources coming from places outside of their empire diminished, Argentina's largest beef market was no longer there for Argentine prosperity. This sent Argentine cattle ranches into dismal economic failure. This is the first slide that addresses the various ways in which governments responded to the continued crisis of the Great Depression. Recall, for many industrialized nations who practiced capitalism, governmental intervention in the nation's economy was not something that was a part of that capitalistic practice. The mere suggestion of governmental intervention into the natural forces of supply and demand became a highly politicized debate. In other nations whose governments had a greater role in their national economies, perhaps intervention was not that great of a transition. However, governmental intervention looked quite different throughout the world. This first slide addresses how the United States' government responded to the Great Depression. In 1930, the United States was dealing with a high unemployment rate and residual effects such as high divorce rates, father abandonment, and suicide. As factories closed and demand for labor declined, unemployment and underemployment became a real problem. Initially, the United States' government looked to put people to work through state-sponsored construction projects, like the building of Hoover Dam. Eventually, under President Franklin Roosevelt, Keynesian economics would be applied, as the government sought to increase its role in stimulating economic growth through more government-sponsored work programs, subsidy programs, and Social Security. This became known as the New Deal in the United States. In the political cartoon to the right, you can see the central figure is President Franklin Roosevelt. and he is surrounded by children with different abbreviated letters on their backs. The WPA was the Works Progress Administration, and as a part of Roosevelt's New Deal, he utilized this program in order to hire unemployed people as laborers in building public works and public buildings. It actually employed more than 8 million workers in its 8-year span. Additionally, the PWA, or the Public Works Administration, was created in order to employ people in the construction of large public works such as dikes, dams, irrigation systems, bridges, hospitals, and schools. You can also see one titled AAA, which stood for the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. This program was passed in tandem with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which sought to subsidize farmers who had overproduced products. In essence, farmers were paid by the federal government to not work or produce, so as to combat overproduction and falling prices. One of the major New Deal programs that Roosevelt enacted was the Social Security Act, which provided a safety net for people who were too old or no longer physically capable of working and earning a wage. It also helped to shift the workforce into a more youthful one by providing a financial benefit to the elderly who could now leave the workforce and opening up jobs for young people who were unemployed or underemployed during the years of the Great Depression. The New Deal was possible through increased taxes and deficit spending, both aspects of Keynesian economics. This slide addresses how some of the European governments responded to the Great Depression. More so than in the United States, socialist and labor-friendly political parties had a long-standing influence in European governments. That means European governments were more used to enacting policies that protected worker rights, wages, and conditions. Political division among labor or socialist, liberal, and conservative political parties provided no real solutions to the Great Depression in any European nation. In England, problems with worker unrest, unemployment, and decline in overseas investments were combated with attempts to balance governmental fiscal budgets and protective tariffs. In France, socialist leaders attempted some work programs and improved worker conditions in what was dubbed the French New Deal. In the image to the right, you can see French Prime Minister Léon Blum, a socialist who extended protections for workers during a time where he felt their labor could have been exploited in the depths of the Great Depression. Blum also helped to develop France's Popular Front, which was a coalition of left-wing, worker-friendly political parties that band together in an attempt to combat the Depression while continuing to protect workers. For communists in France, this meant they had to be willing to move away from their violent, revolutionary, Marxist beliefs in order to join with the French socialists. Both England and France did employ Keynesian economic practices, such as governmental intervention, deficit spending, and increased taxation. However, neither nation fully recovered economically by the outbreak of World War II. In Scandinavian nations, social democratic governments established welfare states that relied on high taxes, increased governmental investment in work and social programs, as well as domestic enterprise. The welfare states that began during the Great Depression would ultimately become the practice of Europe in the years after World War II. However, the Scandinavian states were really the first to establish such states. Today, the critics of the welfare state refer to them as nanny states and draw on their maternal tendencies to take care of society from the cradle to the grave. Today, Europe's welfare states are characterized by high taxes, but provisions of healthcare, college tuition, long-term unemployment payments, and more lenient paid maternity leave are made to Europe's citizens. To be sure, however, despite attempts by European leaders to rethink economic theories and policies and forge political alliances, Western democracies failed to overcome the Great Depression and were weakened by extremist movements. Italy and Germany arguably had the most extreme responses to the Great Depression, as they sought to increase governmental control over labor and production, yet retain corporations and corporate profits. In this political and economic transition, Italian and German political leaders turned to totalitarianism, which ultimately stripped the rights of citizens, including workers, in order to bolster the authority of the government. As political instability coupled with economic decline, some political groups sought extreme changes in government and the government's role in the national economy. For example, fascism became a popular political movement that prioritized the nation, its economy, its military, and its people's racial superiority. In an environment of post-war bitterness, the rising threat of communism, the uncertain transitions to democracy, and economic instability, Benito Mussolini seized power in Italy and instilled a fascist regime that stripped workers' rights to strike in order for industrialists to amp up production at low costs. Adolf Hitler would instill a Nazi regime that did likewise and breached international law per the Treaty of Versailles by reopening armaments factories in order to put Germans back to work. To the right, you can see the images of both Mussolini and Hitler, the totalitarian leaders of Italy and Germany respectively. Mussolini's rise to power came through revolution in the early 1920s, where he and his black shirts, or fascists, forcibly seized power in Rome from King Victor Emmanuel III. In this undemocratic event, Mussolini continued to combat any democratic progress Italy had achieved since its unification in 1870. And with that, he became one of the most powerful political figures in the world. His success in Italy impressed Adolf Hitler in Germany, who in the middle of the 1920s recognized that the Weimar Republic was in no condition to help Germany's financial problems. Hitler believed Germany had been punished too harshly and believed the Weimar Republic was too weak to stand up for itself against the French and English governments that preyed on Germany's demise. In a similar fashion as Mussolini, Hitler attempted a revolt against the Weimar Republic, but it was put down, and Hitler and many of his brown shirts, or Nazis, were imprisoned. During his prison time, Hitler authored Mein Kampf and outlined his plan to bring Germany back to pre-depression status. Upon his release from prison, He reorganized and re-identified his Nazi party, and by the early 1930s, Nazis were gaining an abundance of seats in the Weimar Republic's Reichstag. In fact, in 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor, and in that same year, the Republic enacted the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler dictatorial powers to pass laws without the Republic's support and consent. In essence, fascism and Nazism, as forms of totalitarianism, took extreme action in political and economic sense in their responses to the economic disaster of the interwar period. Fascist dictatorships also used modern technology and propaganda that rejected democratic institutions, promoted charismatic leaders, and glorified war and nationalism to attract their disillusioned and most impressionable citizens. Mussolini and Hitler utilized radio broadcasts to reach their Italian and German populations with fiery speeches about their nation's greatness and superiority. Joseph Goebbels, a German Nazi, statesman in Hitler's Third Reich, and adamant anti-Semite, was Hitler's minister of propaganda. Under his tenure, the Nazis put out a stunning amount of anti-Semitic, racist, and white supremacist propaganda to sway German public opinion. Goebbels would be instrumental during World War II in Hitler's enactment of the final solution during the Holocaust. Additionally, Leni Riefenstahl, a German actress and director, directed Triumph of the Will, which was one of the most influential Nazi propaganda films in Hitler's second year of his reign as Chancellor of Germany. Mussolini and Hitler were masters of creating a cult of personality for themselves, which brainwashed their Italian and German citizens to great levels of anti-Semitism, racism, and white supremacist beliefs, and eventually mobilized those beliefs into actions. This slide emphasizes both the failure of political republicanism and the triumph of fascism and fascist-influenced states in Europe in the mid to late 1930s. Fascism's popularity grew throughout Europe due to the increased status that Mussolini and Hitler brought to their respective states. Both leaders played to Europe's political and ideological vulnerability, and in no other place was that most evident than in Spain. However, their alignment did not just include Spain, but in other European countries where democracies that had been established after the conclusion of World War I had seemingly failed to keep political stability, fascism and Nazism offered a solution. Therefore, authoritarian dictatorships emerged in European nations, such as Spain, Poland, Hungary, and Romania. Political division and ideological tensions were most evident in Spain in 1936. And just a few years earlier, the Second Spanish Republic had been founded through the forging of common ground among Spain's left-wing political groups of socialists and communists. Much like France had assembled a popular front at the time, Spain also attempted to do so. However, Spain's Popular Front could never overcome its right-wing political groups of fascists, militants, and Spanish nationalists. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out between the factions of Spain's political right and the leftists leading the Second Spanish Republic. Francisco Franco emerged as the leader of Spain's right-wing factions. He sought external help to overcome the enfeebled Spanish Republic. He sought out like-minded leaders who glorified the military, blind nationalistic loyalty, and a hatred for communism and socialism. Franco's alliance with fascist leaders like Mussolini and Hitler during the Spanish Civil War represented a testing ground for World War II and resulted in authoritarian rule in Spain from 1936 until the mid-1970s when Franco passed away. Sadly, in a time of weak diplomatic policies by the League of Nations, the Western democracies of England and France did not intervene in the Spanish Civil War. In fact, the only nation who aligned against Franco during the Spanish Civil War in order to combat the strengthening of fascism and Nazism was the Soviet Union. As mentioned earlier, few nations' economies were outside of the scope of the global Great Depression. One such example was the Soviet Union. Merely a decade old during the Depression, the Soviet Union served as a model for communism as a viable alternative to capitalism. The fact that a nation could still industrialize, produce, and increase its gross domestic product through a planned and highly regulated economic system meant that there was an alternative to the failing capitalistic economies elsewhere. Politically, the Soviet Union also turned toward totalitarianism, as Soviet leadership took total control over the means of production, the press, and many aspects of everyday life. Joseph Stalin implemented a command economy in the enactment of his first 5 years plan. This plan sought to rapidly industrialize and militarize Russia to an unprecedented level. Soviet Russia was the only industrialized nation whose GDP continuously increased during the worst years of the Great Depression. In spite of an authoritarian regime that led to purges, forced labor, and failed food distribution policies, the Soviet model of communism became appealing in many nations worldwide. In the liberal democracies of Western Europe and North America, communist parties gained popularity. Outside of the West, communism gained popularity, especially in China in the interwar period. Stalin's economic policies within his 5 years plan was a drastic turn away from his predecessor, Vladimir Lenin, and his economic policies. Lenin had actually utilized free market capitalistic practices that had allowed for private land ownership, unrestricted wages, and corporate private enterprise. Stalin's 5 years plan eradicated Lenin's policies and completely instituted a centralized command economy in which production and consumption were completely regulated by the Soviet government. Russia, under Stalin, would experience rapid economic modernization. However, Stalin's economic modernization of the Soviet Union came at a high price, including the liquidation of the kulaks, a small class of land-owning peasants that had gained a significant degree of financial status since the abolition of serfdom in the 1860s. Others that paid the high price of Stalin's rapid modernization were anyone who were perceived enemies of the state. In addition, his economic modernization was also devastating to the people of Ukraine, where a large famine ensued because of his faulty planned economy. Political enemies were violently put down in the creation of Stalin's oppressive political system. Stalin's rapid economic modernization included farm collectivization and production quotas. His collectivization policy was really just the nationalization of Russia's arable land, ending the tradition of private land ownership. Russian peasants were expected to meet high quotas of production, and if they could not, then they were subjected to imprisonment, beatings, and in some cases, execution. Stalin utilized an oppressive political system to combat enemies of his political and economic practices. He purged members of his own Communist Party who opposed his radical ideas and actions. He would hold show trials and public executions as a scare tactic to other members of the Communist Party. He put political opponents in gulags, or work camps, and forced them into brutal labor and terrible living conditions, in which many of the prisoners died from starvation and deprivation. To control the Russian citizenry, Stalin deployed his secret police to infiltrate gatherings of Russians who may oppose Stalin's command. Russia's model economic modernization and oppressive political systems would be utilized later in the century in places outside of Europe, including China, North Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam as viable alternatives to capitalism and democracy. In the interwar period, fascism, extreme nationalism, racist ideologies, and the failures to manage those factors resulted in the catastrophe of World War II, presenting a grave challenge to European civilization. French and British fears of another war, American isolationism, and deep distrust between Western democratic capitalist nations and the authoritarian communist Soviet Union allowed fascist states to rearm and expand their territory. Fascist states like Italy and Germany were virtually allowed to expand with little to no repercussions by other European powers. England and France's use of appeasement throughout the mid to late 1930s allowed for Nazi Germany's remilitarization of the Rhineland, which was a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. English and French appeasement allowed for the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, as Italian naval vessels and military vehicles moved right on past English colonies and military protectorates in Northeast Africa. English and French appeasement allowed Hitler to form the Anschluss, or union with Austria. Recall, Austria had been a new formed nation per the Treaty of Versailles after the forced dissolution of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Worse, an agreement made between English Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler in the German city of Munich allowed Germany to acquire a portion of the newly formed nation of Czechoslovakia. Within a short time, the remaining territory and population of Czechoslovakia would be annexed by Hitler, and the English and French responses was nothing. No question, Hitler and Mussolini disrespected the Treaty of Versailles and breached international law. But in many instances throughout the mid to late 1930s, those offenses were met with little to no punishment. England and France were so committed to keeping peace in their time that they allowed for the conditions of war to permeate and to be played out in their near future.